Welcome to Writing and Fighting, and a virtual panel reflecting on Muhammad Ali's influence on race, politics, and human rights in 2020. Thank you, and please, this is in honor of the 4th anniversary of Muhammad Ali's death. This panel will unpack Ali's influence on boxing, politics, and how his legacy intersects with America's current events in race relations and human rights. About a month ago, Tanisha and I collaborated on a panel focusing on gender, media, and combat sports, which brought together 10 women from the MMA community, including former fighters, broadcasters, writers, and academics, which revealed several unspoken narratives. 2 weeks ago, we began talks on a panel focusing on race and combat sports, and we thought we could commemorate this with the anniversary of Muhammad Ali and Muhammad Ali's death. We never fathomed how imperative and necessary this discussion would become. Today, people all over the country and the world are protesting for racial equality after the unjust deaths of Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and Ahmaud Arbery. A few hours ago, Ali's wife, Lonnie, said this: "We still need Muhammad's voice." I can think of no other group of such knowledgeable and insightful people to bring that out. Quickly, I will introduce the panel, and please say hi so that it's on speaker view. It will go to you. So first, we have Andreas Hale.
How you doing?
He's a senior editor of Combat Sports and Sporting News and Design USA News, curator of culture, and the co-host of the Corner podcast. Thank you, Andreas.
Thank you.
We have Morgan Campbell. You say hi. We got that? National Newspaper Award winner at Toronto Star, Tedx speaker, and the graduate of Medill School of Journalism at Northwestern University.
Hey, thank you for having me, guys. I appreciate it.
Thanks. We have Corey Erdman.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
Corey Erdman is a boxing, track, and field commentator, sports writer with Vice and Boxing Scene. He's a filmmaker, former host of The Breakdown on Showtime Sports. Thank you, Corey.
Thank you for having me.
We have Michael Ezra.
Hi, everybody.
Thank you, Mike. He's a professor of American Multicultural Studies at Sonoma State University. His books include Muhammad Ali, The Making of an Icon, The Economic Civil Rights Movement, African Americans and the Struggle for Economic Power. Thank you, Michael. We have Dannika Lewis.
Hello.
Yes. She's a professor of literature and director of women and gender studies at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte. She specializes in African American literature and has written a book, Freedom Narratives of African American Women, and articles on representations of play and sports, specifically baseball and African American literature.
Good to be here. Thank you.
Is Bijan here?
Yes,
Bijan, great to see you.
I just walked in the door. It took me 2.5 hours to get back from downtown DC.
I
There's
understand.
police downtown with riot gear, so I couldn't get an Uber.
I understand. Well, just in time. You're an award-winning Washington-based columnist and critic, a leading literary historian on U.S. relations with books including Sky Kings, Black Pioneers of Professional Basketball, bestseller, Elgin Baylor, The First Superstar, Martha's Vineyard Basketball, How a Resort League Defied Notions of Race and Class. Thank you, Bijan. I'm so glad you got here.
Barely.
There.
Just walked in the door.
I love it. And then lastly, I think, Morgan, you said you'd be proud to be on his undercard. Randy Roberts. Randy, can you say hello?
Hello.
Hello. A distinguished professor of history at Purdue. Teaches multiple courses on boxing history, an award-winning author and historian who is renowned for his combination of historical discourse and free discussion. Lists of works include books on Joe Louis, Jack Dempsey, and co-authored Blood Brothers, The Fatal Friendship Between Muhammad Ali and Malcolm X. And as we just said before, he is featured in Ken Burns' Muhammad Ali, which is coming out next year, as well as Blood Brothers, which will be on Netflix. All right. Now, I want to introduce my wonderful co-host. Again, I am ready. And also, if people could mute if you have anyone else.
Can you mute yourself? I think we're getting some feedback from you.
Thank you. So Nancy Kidder, I am the an adjunct professor at American University, where I teach a course called Writing and Fighting on the literature of combat sports. So this panel is who I curate and who I celebrate. And I'm very thankful to have a co-chair, the wonderful Tanisha Singleton, an adjunct professor of media psychology at Fielding Graduate University, where she earned her PhD in the same field, specializing in identity, digital disruption, and understanding the human experience and technology's role in it. With a decade of experience in traditional entertainment, Tanisha has turned her attention to tackling her passion in sports, aiming to equip athletes and progressive brands with marketing and media management to reinforce authentic storytelling, culture, and conversation. Thank you, Tanisha.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you to all that are logging on, texting me, and especially to all of the participants and speakers that we have here on this panel today. As I mentioned in a bunch of tweets promoting this, these are the minds and these are the people that I want to be hearing from right now. This distinguished group and this esteemed panel, these are the words that I think the entire world needs to hear from right now. So quickly to kind of just debrief on how I'm feeling about all of this and putting it in context of Muhammad Ali's anniversary of his death. This is the most exhausting I have been in my entire life. I feel heavy, emotionally, mentally. It's time we cut the crap and really just address the problem. This pandemic, over 100,000 American lives lost, damn near 40 million filing for unemployment, and more Black people dying at the hands of those who were sworn in to serve and protect. It's all related. The calls, texts, DMs from friends, Black and white, checking in to see how I'm doing, I appreciate it all, but I'm exhausted. And I don't have all the answers. I never claim to have them. And I think that's part of what kind of pisses me off and what I think is shared about other people in thinking about just my small role as a Black woman in this situation, is that I'm constantly looked at as if I'm supposed to have the answers and to provide comfort to others, when in actuality, like, who's comforting me? How am I supposed to make sense of all of this? Because it's like, okay, Black people not only have to suffer from 6+ centuries of oppression and a system literally engineered to sustain it, but now we're solely responsible for fixing it too? No. People can check whatever box they want, but if that box means that you're suppressing the civil liberties and the rights of the man and woman next to you, then I got a problem. And it's just like what Toni Morrison said. If you can only be tall because someone else is on their knees, then you have a serious problem. And white people have a very, very serious problem in this country. And she said that back in 1998. And we all know that, of course, echoes the men that we're remembering today by having this conversation, because the parallels in time and tension right now, it's clear. We have a stronger ability now to record and document all the wrongdoings in real time, because we all know that the advancement of media and technology today, that's our armor right now. And we can continually show that the US specifically continues to snitch on itself time and time again. But what would Muhammad Ali do today? Many of us have been saying it across social media, in that I wish America loved Black people the way they love Black culture. Black culture is the fabric of sports and entertainment, but we've never been looked at as equal. Boxing, wrestling, these are the oldest recognized forms of sport in ancient history, but Black people have never been looked at as just human. It's always something to marvel at. Like, oh, look, he ran that 440, or look at that dunk, or look, he can float like a butterfly and sting like a bee. Ali knew that. Muhammad Ali was very aware, and Muhammad Ali called it as he saw it, and he didn't try and make it pretty. And that's what we have to do, and that's what we're going to talk about today in plain English: how to stop white supremacy. Because until we stop trying to sugarcoat things, we're doing Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Eric Garner, and 6 centuries worth of victims a disservice. So with that, I want to open this up to a conversation, and I'm going to lead in with Randy first with my first question, thinking about everything in all of this context. Randy, as a historian with esteemed boxing knowledge, help us provide some perspective of Ali's influence within politics at that time and put that in context of today's current climate with the uprisings.
Well, when Ali died, I happened to be on the road and I was doing interviews with various radio stations and television stations, what have you. And I heard an Ali described as this kind of symbol of peace, tolerance, unity. And it was mostly the idea of Ali that he transcended race, okay, that somehow, and I'm listening to this and I'm saying to myself, God, that's not the Ali I remember. That's not the Ali from the 1960s. That Ali may have transcended sports, and I think he certainly did transcend sports, but he certainly never, in my mind, never transcended race. He was unapologetically Black from the very beginning. He affirmed the power and beauty of Blackness. You know, Ali became a Muslim. He changed his name. He spoke out against white supremacy. He confronted government because of his experience as a Black man, okay? Not because of his experience as a person who transcended race. When he declared, you know, ain't I beautiful, okay? You know, that was coming from being a Black man. And when he was saying, I am the greatest, I mean, is there a better example of the expression of Black power than Ali gave? And so what I tried to do with Johnny Smith, my co-author, in the book that I read is to talk about how did Cassius Clay become Muhammad Ali? What was the metamorphosis? What was the translation? How did this really take place? And so the book, you know, Blood Brothers, Johnny and I, we looked at kind of this stage by stage, where first Ali was Cassius Marcellus Clay Jr., where he was born. He loved the name Cassius Marcellus Clay, and he was representative of the good Black American. He went to the Olympics. He spoke out in favor of American ideals. When a Russian confronted him with the reality of race in America, Cassius Marcellus Clay said, "Don't worry, we've got smart people, we've got good people working on that. And it may be hard for me to get a meal sometimes, but things are getting better." It is the exact message that the white power structure in America wanted Cassius Clay to present. Then he becomes the Louisville Lip. You know, the entertainer, the performer, the self-proclaimed savior of boxing, focused on fame, on fortune, he talked repeatedly, and Michael Ezra's here, and I'm sure Michael's read the same articles that I have about getting a tomato red Cadillac with a TV set in it and a record player and phonograph. And all this, he was presented as a Bible reader, you know, as he trained, he didn't smoke, he didn't swear, he avoided political discussions. He avoided civil rights marches. He wanted nothing really to do with civil rights whatsoever. But then secretly during this period, starting in about 1962, he becomes the third person that we refer to as Cassius X. He becomes a performer. The Louisville Lip is a persona, but behind this persona, behind the closed doors, he becomes a follower of Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm X. He visits mosques. He hears the Black Muslim ministers denounce the crimes of the white man. You know, 1963, summer of 1963, we had a killing of Ronald Stokes in Los Angeles, which helped make Malcolm X famous when he went out there, and helped make the Elijah Muhammad and Muhammad Speaks famous. And so he starts, still Cassius Clay, but you can hear the echoes, the voice of Malcolm X in some of his speeches. You know, the separatism was coming out. And then finally, he's renamed by Elijah Muhammad Ali. Okay, and this is his beginning of the rejection of Malcolm X, something that I think he'll feel very sorry for later in his life. And this is when he becomes This is during the era of the revolt of the black athlete, and Ali becomes a symbol of this. And he becomes a global symbol at this time, an international symbol. Anyway, I've talked enough about Ali. I'm like to hear what other people think, but that's kind of the framework that I bring to Ali. And it's a framework that I bring to the discussion today. It's all about, what can Black people do differently that somehow we can solve our problems. It's not a Black problem. And Ali saw it was not a Black problem. It's a white problem. It was a white problem in the 1950s and the 1960s, and it's a white problem today.
Right. Now you bring up several interesting points that are so clutch. And Michael, I do want to pass it over to you and trying to help us kind of define that cultural icon appeal that Randy just kind of alluded to, and how that presence kind of resonates today.
Yeah, okay, sure. I think there's a couple of streams going on with Ali, and what Randy Roberts just said is that the misinterpretation of Muhammad Ali is as important at this point as the facts of his life. So what the thesis of my framework was in studying Muhammad Ali was that whomever he is really making money for is what will determine public response to him. So for me, it wasn't really so much the Vietnam War draft resistance that turned the public against Ali and got him suspended from boxing. It's more like he had the Nation of Islam begin to promote his boxing matches. And that's when I really saw the boxing establishment and local government begin to move in unison against Ali. And I might be overstating that point in my own work. It might be a combination of Vietnam and the Nation of Islam taking over his fights and the promotion and the profits from them, becoming a Black nationalist economic enterprise. But when you look at the history of Muhammad Ali, it's been reduced to his Vietnam War stance. So as I go through the years and see the ups and downs of Muhammad Ali's kind of public image, what I see is the image makers behind it. And when Ali started to make money for corporate America, and that message resonated with the public, and it became mutually beneficial for both Ali and his sponsors, then there was a shift in public opinion toward Ali at that time. So for me, Ali's never an independent cultural icon functioning outside of his economic benefactors and those who would profit off his image. And that's what I tried to express in the book.
No, that's amazing. And it leads into kind of my next question that I want to put to Morgan, because in your TED Talk, race, sports, and telling true stories, you talk about the athlete's story, their own personal brand, and having to sometimes be reduced to just a prop because of subconscious stereotypes that white journalists will use when trying to describe the Black athlete. Can you kind of elaborate on that and link that into Ali's legacy and these multiple layers here?
Yeah, well, what we have in like Muhammad Ali in the current popular imagination is like the ultimate prop. Like Martin Luther King and Muhammad Ali are like batting 1 and 2 in the batting order in terms of really strident, radical Black people who have their words like willfully misconstrued and quoted out of context by white people who want to make them into something that they're not. And a lot of people have pointed this out, but like the reason you can do that with Dr. King is because he died in 1968, like he's not here now. And then with Ali, like so much of the final 2.5 decades of his life, he couldn't speak that clearly and stopped speaking at all. So now all these people can just fill in the blanks with what they imagine Muhammad Ali would have said about this, what Muhammad Ali would have said about that, right? And for better and for worse. So like when the NBA was going through this tiff with China before the season started, and LeBron James did not jump out and bash the Chinese government, then, a columnist, a colleague of mine said, well, here's what Muhammad Ali would have said, to the point where he put it in quotes, like, here's what Ali would have said. Ali would have said, although it is to my detriment financially, I detest the government of China. I'm like, you don't know he would have said that. He fought in Zaire with Mobutu. You don't know what he would have said. But because Muhammad Ali, again, for the final 2 decades of his life, let's say, didn't speak a lot, couldn't speak in public, so sports writers and everyone else kind of rushes in to fill this void with what they imagine he would have said. And, which I guess makes for good posters, and you can hashtag it and you can share on social media and make it seem like you really care about what Black people are going through. But it really diminishes like the popular understanding of who this human being was. And the other thing, I was just thinking about it now, and quick aside, a couple years back, 4 years ago, I did a story about the 50th anniversary of Ali versus George Chuvalo, which was in Toronto. This is kind of at this turning point, in Ali's career. It's because it's after he said, I got no quarrel with the Viet Cong. It's before he gets his license suspended, and the fight winds up in Toronto for a lot of reasons. Licensing, couldn't sell, stuff like this, opponents falling through. But I had a really good conversation with Randy's co-author, Johnny Smith, about this. And Johnny and I started talking about, how we each got into doing what we do. I told him I went to Northwestern. Johnny Smith is from Evanston, Illinois. And so here's the thing, and one of the things Johnny told me really pushed him into becoming a historian. It was the summer of 1999. So here's Johnny and I at different points. Of summer of 1999, I'm graduating from Northwestern. And this very week, the anniversary might be tomorrow, a classmate and a teammate of mine on the football team named Bobby Russ, he was shot dead by a Chicago police officer after a low-speed chase that started when Bobby Russ, all he did was change lanes without signaling, right? And he gets killed. And there was another police shooting that same day of a woman named LaTanya Haggerty. So this is all in the summer of 1999. A month after that, Northwestern's former basketball coach, Ricky Birdsong, Black coach, was outside his house jogging in Skokie, Illinois, and is shot dead by a white supremacist, like he'd been on this shooting spree. So Randy's telling me like those events really helped push him towards becoming a historian. And so now like Black people getting killed by police in Muhammad Ali's day, as Randy pointed out, that's what brought Malcolm X to Los Angeles. Black people getting killed by police in 1999, that's what pushes Randy Roberts into becoming a historian and helping give us Blood Brothers, which is an amazing book. If you guys haven't read it, please read it. And 2020, I don't know if we're allowed to swear on here, but we're still protesting this shit. That's what stands out to me.
Yeah, no, absolutely. If I haven't cussed already, I know it will too, so don't worry about that. But Andreas, I want to tie this over to you now, because I know I listened to your latest episode of the Corner podcast with you and Hale, and you talked a little bit about celebrity, the public figures, and linking it to these uprisings. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about this and how Ali's legacy kind of intersects with that, and also some of your history local here in Las Vegas in terms of activism and what you think needs to really be done right now that would honor Ali's legacy and current events.
Yeah, well, first and foremost, I mean, the idea of who Muhammad Ali is, was, and always has been romanticized to a degree that we lose a lot of what Muhammad Ali went through, brought to the table, and it gets diluted over the years. And what happens is when Muhammad Ali couldn't talk, he was no longer a threat. And when he was no longer a threat, he was able to be embraced. Because if Muhammad Ali could talk, we have an idea of maybe how he would approach these situations. Now, if you look at the athlete of today, there wasn't marketing and branding and your attachment to like Michael Jordan being attached to Hanes and hot dogs and Gatorade. Athletes look out for themselves more than they look out for anybody else. So when we ask celebrities to speak and athletes to speak, sometimes you don't really want to know what they have to say or what they think. So we have to be very careful. When we look at Floyd Mayweather donating to George Floyd, basically covering the funeral, people say, why does he do more? No, we need to accept that and embrace that, because that's probably all he can really bring to the table, because no disrespect to Floyd Mayweather, but the brother doesn't like to talk publicly about these issues. So that's his approach. And we need to embrace that particular approach. When we look at other athletes, we look at Colin Kaepernick, people talk about Colin Kaepernick and get upset when you try to compare it to Muhammad Ali. But I think the thing here that we forget is There was a long period of time where Muhammad Ali was hated. There was a long period of time when Colin Kaepernick was hated. They don't love you until you're gone. They don't love you until you're out the league. They don't love you until you're no longer here speaking, because if Colin Kaepernick was still talking, there would be a lot of people still disliking him. So I think the way we romanticize what celebrities are supposed to do when these situations come up is dangerous, because we don't really want to hear him speak. I don't really want to hear what Kanye West has to say. I don't want to hear what Lil Wayne has to say. There's certain athletes that I don't care what you have to say. But if you want to donate to the cause, then do that. Now, for me, before I started sports journalism, I was in music journalism. I worked with the Grammys, Billboard. I ran websites like Hip Hop DX and Hip Hop Site. I was the chairman of a local organization community of the National Hip Hop Political Convention. And on the ground here, we organized and we protested when they tried to ban hip hop music from the Strip about a decade ago. And we marched and we did those other things. And what I've come to realize over the years is, in order to progress, it's like the pandemic that's going on right now. We have to expect it to mutate and change. And that's what white supremacy has done over the years. You can't use the same approach. You can't say if Ali was here, that would work, because white supremacy has changed and we have to change our approach, which means we need to understand and learn the legal system. And I look at it like a football team. The protesting is the offensive line, but you need a quarterback. You need a wide receiver. You need running backs. And when people say protesting doesn't work, that means you take away the offensive line. If you take away the offensive line, the quarterback gets sacked. We need to create a team, and we have to have a multi-pronged approach to systemically change the laws and the future of African Americans in this country. It's a hard approach, and some people don't want to hear it. People get upset today because it's like, well, why isn't the cop getting a first-degree murder charge? Well, we need to understand the legal system and why we overcharged on George Zimmerman and why that man ended up walking. But we need to learn that, and everybody has to play a role. And I think if somebody like Muhammad Ali was here, it couldn't be him by himself. He would need to motivate and energize youth to either protest, to go to law school, to be in the police force, to be the journalists, to be the storytellers, to get these points across, because we have a completely different system than we had 30 years ago. So I think Muhammad Ali's energized a lot of us. I know myself, he was an individual that I looked to as a child and thought he was amazing. And I was like, well, if he can kick ass both in and out of the ring, I want to do the same with writing and with journalism. So I think we all need to take notes from that on the 4th anniversary of his death and move forward. But we have to look at it as there's not going to be one way to fix this. There are multiple approaches that we need to take.
Yeah, I love that. I love that analogy too about the football players and everybody having a role, because even when I study community psychology, one of the, you've got different members and everyone has their own function. So you have the leaders, facilitators, information distributors, and often I think the member function that is not discussed enough is that of the ally and the advocate. And it hasn't been until recently where people are actually knowing now that the pressure needs to be put on non-Black people. And this isn't our problem, as Randy opened this and saying this, like this needs to be a everyone problem. And looking at the allies, supporters, the advocates of civil rights, and to actually do something. Because the alternative is what? Our current state right now. And so being able to actually have a plan, finding resources, like you said, to support Black-owned businesses, become more educated, and informing others, and starting with your kids and having these type of conversations, I think is super, super important. I do want to, let's toss it over to Bijan, because I know you had a couple of great pieces that you've written in your history about studying Muhammad Ali, particularly about like him being a hated figure. And we've touched on that a little bit because of him calling out, misrepresentation and oppression that's systemic within the government. So I'd love to hear your take on this and adding on the conversation of Ali's legacy.
Well, thanks for having me, and thank you, Dr. Singleton and Professor Kidder for including me in this dialogue. The earliest that Ali was really reviled in media and in the eyes of fans was probably not really, well, actually, if you think about it, Ali was reviled by some of the fan base and some media before he announced that he was a member of the Nation of Islam, but most of it was because he was considered brash and that he was considered arrogant, and that people did not know, since he was predicting the rounds in which many of his opponents would fall, a lot of people like Jack Parr and Jerry Lewis, when they would have him on late night TV, were skeptical that the fights were legit, and they thought that they might have been fixed since he was so accurate about predicting the knockout rounds on 11 occasions. And so he already had rubbed a lot of journalists and a lot of sort of World War II era people the wrong way, because to their way of thinking, athletes didn't really boast like that. Athletes didn't spout a whole bunch of poetry. Archie Moore had done a little, but it wasn't his trademark. And he seemed just too self-absorbed. But once he announced, as everyone here knows, that threw his the national disdain for him into another dimension, because at that time, even Orthodox Islam was not widely understood in the United States, much less the Nation of Islam. And because it seemed such a shock to the national system that he was a member, because he was only 22, he was barely 22 when he upset Liston. He was considered, I think, to Randy's point, sort of clean cut, sort of refreshing, especially in light of Liston being associated with the mob. He was considered a much better draw than Liston and Patterson because he was quote worthy, great copy, and things like that. And it's kind of funny. He had this image. He had a two-edged image of a clean-cut, God-fearing, loves his family, loves his mom and dad, is always citing his mom and dad, but he's just a little too cocky. So when he announced that he was a member of what was termed a separatist group, the first time that he defended his title against Liston, it became hard to promote the fight because Liston was considered mobbed up, and Liston had been incarcerated and was sort of a reformed incarceree, much like Patterson, but a little bit more violent and edgy than Patterson. And Ali was a member of this sect that was supposed to hate all white people. So when Malcolm X got killed, one of the many reasons why the fight was moved, the rematch was moved from the Boston Garden to Lewiston, Maine, among the threat of the rift between people who had left the nation with Malcolm and allied with Malcolm and the people who still were loyal to Elijah Muhammad, and also the fact that a lot of the skirmishes that occurred between those two groups had actually occurred in Boston around members that were from Temple Number 11 in Roxbury. And the fight was supposed to have been in the Boston Garden in November '64. Then Ali got a hernia, as you all know, and they postponed it. And through the postponement, they ended up moving it. One of the reasons they moved it is because it didn't have the gate appeal that it had originally. Now that both fighters were considered these nefarious. One associated with mob, one associated with a hate group. So if you look at from 1964 to 1975, no heavyweight champion was invited to the White House, or at least Ali wasn't invited to the White House, which means from the time that Patterson visits JFK around 62, and JFK encouraged Patterson to defeat Liston because Patterson was Catholic and he was considered clean living, and Liston was considered somebody that had been used by gangsters. From that period through part of the Ford administration, no heavyweight champion visited the White House. That's how reviled Ali was. He was the most hated public figure in America. He got death threats before fights. He got columnists like Jimmy Cannon, columnists like not Red Smith so much, but I'm thinking of another New York columnist that was a contemporary of Jimmy Cannon, always took him to task in their op-eds because they felt him unpatriotic And going back to the point about 1966, when his draft status was revised or updated, and he expressed his disinterest in serving in Southeast Asia, that soundbite or that quote that played all around the world led media to go out on the street and ask people on the street who, reporters asked, well, what do you feel about the fact that he doesn't want to serve and he doesn't want to fulfill his obligation to his country? And people, not only in hate mail, but in op-eds and in news columns, but just average people on the street said things like, well, I have a son serving over there. What makes him think he's any better than my son? Or I have to go over there. I don't have a lot of money. He's making $250,000 per fight. He wouldn't be able to benefit from that lucrative profession if it wasn't for the country that he's living in. So I think that he should have to fulfill his obligations, because he's ungrateful. He has all this money. He's making all this money per fight, and he doesn't appreciate the country that has provided that opportunity. Whereas he, of course, positioned it like, it's not really about me making more money than the average person that's going over there to serve. It's about the message that it would send if I served, even if I only fought exhibitions like Joe Louis did, which they did provide me that option. But it's also about, and this is where the hatred got fueled, it's also about the amount of money that I'm taxed from these fights is enough money to, in his words, to buy a bomber plane. So he said, people are not even looking at me the same way that they're looking at the average working class person. So, that degree of venom and Lester Maddox lowering the flags to half staff the day that he came out of exile to fight Jerry Quarry, October 26, 1970, declaring it a day of mourning in Georgia. The Veterans of Foreign War, when he fought Bonavina in his second comeback fight, December 7th, 1970, saying that it was pretty much sacrilege for him to be fighting on Pearl Harbor Day. All these things really just give you a sense of just how despised he was.
Yeah.
Right. I could certainly see that, and for sure. And there's multiple layers on how he can be, rebranded and framed in a hateful manner throughout the country. I do want to be cognizant of time, so I do want to make sure that we hear from our other panelists here. So Dannika, I want to turn it over to you first, because I think on that message of storytelling and history within the Black community, I definitely want to get your perspective on one area that I've noticed trending on social media lately, and that's the burden of strength that's on the Black woman. And that line of, heavy as the crown she wears, yet she makes it feel and look like a feather, So I would love to hear your thoughts on your research within African-American literature in the context of this, and how Ali's legacy translates across genders.
Absolutely. And it's notable that this conversation started with women. And we think about Ali's legacy, and I want to thank you, Nancy and Tanisha, for dealing with all the complex layers of his legacy. So a couple pieces I want to make sure I get to. First of all, we know that nationalism and Black nationalism did not put women first. And so we have this idea that even though Ali had this complex legacy of what it meant to be Black in America, it did not necessarily connect directly to benefits for women. And I deal with narratives and storytelling. And so we also have, the legacy of, several of his wives saying that he was a terrible partner, a terrible spouse. He was an evil man. And so what do we do with that, with this idea of what he opened up for America? And so a couple pieces I just, been thinking about. First of all, the idea that first America said he wasn't good enough for the Army. He failed his the first test in writing and spelling. And then they changed the rules. They reclassified in 1965. And so this idea that you can't even opt out as a Black person, as a Black man, of this idea of what it means to be American, right? So that leading up to the idea of having to sue for one's right to fight after one has been successful in fighting. And I thought immediately, my kids, I have a 6-year-old and a 9-year-old, and we were thinking about Sojourner Truth and the idea that she sued for the freedom of children who belong to her. First, who the country said, they're not yours, then they have to follow your conditions. Or if you're enslaved, they belong to you. So this idea when she, writes or speaks, aren't I a woman? If I am the mother, they do belong to me. And so, connecting with this legacy of Muhammad Ali, who has the right to object and who is able to benefit from the legacy of being an American? What does it even mean to be an American? And so all of these ideas that, he's dealing with, that Black women are dealing with before and after. And so all of these layers, even thinking about the histories of gender in sport. And one of my colleagues, Christiana Obi Nelson, who teaches race and sport at UNC Charlotte, always having conversations about, what it meant for Black women athletes. We have women who were competing in the Olympics, from the 1930s from Tuskegee, who weren't able to compete in LA in 1936, and then able to compete in Berlin. And so all of the histories that came, before Ali, that certainly informed, how America saw him based on the success of African-American athletes in the Olympics. And so all of this is to say, it's a complicated legacy, and definitely, we have benefited from what he spoke out against, absolutely. But what we don't necessarily see is who else was speaking, who else was along in that fight that doesn't necessarily get recognized. And it very much speaks to where we are today, where we have, Black women's tears representing something where their voices are silent. Or even as we think about toxic masculinity, we can celebrate in certain sports, but when you open your mouth, then you're condemned. Fight, but don't speak. Use your voice only when responding to what you're asked. And so this idea of even not being able to be told you're a conscientious objector, right? Because how dare you have a conscience that's different from what Blacks are supposed to represent in America. And so gender is very much a part of this conversation and the complicated legacy that I hope we will continue to discuss.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. Perfectly said. And it is so multi-layered. And Corey, I want to take it to you now, because I know with your vested interest in where race and sports and gender collide, I know you wrote a fascinating piece chronicling the history of Black women in professional wrestling, which, I retweet all the time because that's my jam. But I do want to, I want to ask you about the storytelling perspective of it, and with your roles as a boxing commentator and sports media storyteller, what do you make of all of this and the multiple layers here when we've got race, gender, branding, representations, and legacy?
Yeah, well, I mean, speaking to race specifically, I wrote a piece that went up on Medium yesterday, kind of discussing the fact that if you're in the boxing industry in a reporting capacity, if you're talking about boxing for a living, then we're at a point where sticking to sports just is not an option. And I understand, and Andreas put it very well, that not everyone can necessarily be an ally in the very same way. And as we're seeing, with Drew Brees today, or name any other athlete, not everyone should necessarily speak on every single topic. But if you're given the opportunity to be involved in boxing, which I have been, you're given a marvelous lens into America. I've been doing this for around 14 years now, and I've been given the opportunity to go to gyms across the United States, across Canada. When you're interacting with race and class and gender in boxing, it's not like an abstract thing. If you're covering football, let's say, you mostly interact with football players in kind of posh training facilities and at the stadium. When you're interacting with boxers, you're actually going into those gyms. If you're interacting with Andre Ward, you're going into Oakland. You're going to the Kronk gym if you're talking to fighters in Detroit. You're going to Tuscaloosa if you're interacting with Deontay Wilder. So you get to see these things. So I don't think that you should have the ability to just ignore these things. Maybe, not everyone has to write lengthy social justice pieces, but to just not acknowledge race is really giving up an opportunity that you've been given in this sport. We're in this sport that has produced civil rights icons like Ali and Joe Louis and Jack Johnson and so many influential and integral figures in our world's history. You're just giving a lot up if you don't bother to ever interact with that or think about it whatsoever.
You're choosing ignorance at that point, if that's what you're doing.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the joys of covering boxing, as many of my other panelists here can agree with, is how open and transparent and how accessible these fighters are. And that is a part of their story. It's not all of it. It's not, the entirety of their story. Just that, you've had panels in the past about covering women's athletes, and women's trauma is not necessarily the entirety of their story. But to ignore it entirely, I think, is just not acceptable, and certainly not right now.
Right. No, right. I saw in the chat, Margaret was asking for what that piece was titled that you wrote on Medium. And correct me if I'm wrong, it's "No Boxing Matches Worth Discussing Over the Fight for Justice and Equality." That's the one you're referring to, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And right now, I mean, and you could read the piece as well, but, there are some very interesting things when it comes to boxing itself that people don't talk about. For example, there was a study in 2019 that proved that Black fighters die sooner than white fighters as well. Now, why is that? Well, because boxers are actual people, and boxing is not, in a silo. They're connected to the real world, and it proved also that when Black fighters, non-white fighters, retire, they don't get the same jobs that white fighters get. White fighters get to sell cars and just kind of profit off of being a gutsy white fighter. But Black fighters just go, they relinquish the status and the money that might have sheltered them from certain aspects of oppression while they're fighting. They go back to just being Black. So there are a lot of things that we can analyze here within the sport of boxing that we so often just choose to ignore.
Well, shit. No, I know we've got about 15 minutes before. I know we wanted to try and wrap up at 5 o'clock so that we could all switch over and watch former President Barack Obama speak at 5 o'clock Eastern time. So if anybody in the Zoom has a question, feel free to use the chat feature right there or raise your hand that way. But Nancy, I know you had some statistics and quotes, and we can open this up now for anyone to jump in and discuss. So Nancy, what did you have?
Well, I kind of want to bring a lot of these threads together because it's been so informative and insightful, because what Michael said about the image. This is what I think is interesting. When I bring up Muhammad Ali, and we usually bring one of your texts in, and a lot of my students who were born in 2001, can you believe it, 2002, they really only know Ali as the GOAT, greatest of all time, and the hero, the person that they've been told did great things and maybe even have a lasting image of him at the 2012 London Olympics. So when we go back and we start reading articles, and we read them we read your text, like things that are written after, and then we also read we were talking about the ones from the time period written, and it's almost like their head explodes because they had no idea. And Dannika, we were talking about this, about reframing and how corporate America, it's a more palatable narrative, right? Of him as the hero, and him as this greatest boxer of all time, because he has rough edges and some worse than others. But I think even his activism is something that this narrative, and whether it's, I have to say, maybe a white, kind of majority narrative. And anyone, if we could speak to this, I would love to kind of unpack how we get away from this.
I think if I can say something. Ali, to me, maybe the most significant thing he said took place in February 26, 1964, the day after the Liston fight, where an Ali shows up at the press conference, the day after press conference of boxing tradition, and he's dressed in a Oxford cut shirt, button collar, patches on his elbows. And he's very moderate. He's not saying I'm the greatest. That everything he said the night before, I shook the world. He talks about himself, and this is when he declares that he is, yes, a Muslim. But he also says, I don't have to be who you want me to be. I'm free to be me. This idea, this declaration of independence of an athlete, of any person, I don't have to be that image of white America. I don't have to be that image of Black America. I can be whatever image I want. I've always found that really interesting. In the same way as I found Eldridge Cleaver, who I used to read in the 1960s, one time said, boxing is a two-fisted testing ground of masculinity in America. And the heavyweight champion is a symbol, as a real Mr. America. I mean, you put those two quotes together, and Cleaver was talking about Ali, and I think you begin to delve into the significance of Ali.
Yeah, Michael, thank you, Randy. That is, that he didn't have to be what anyone wanted him, and that's something we got to remember. Michael, can you talk more about what people thought of Ali and what that overall narrative in the 80s was? Is Mike there? Mike Ezra?
I'm mute.
Yeah, he's still on mute.
There we go.
There we go.
Sorry about that. Yeah, people do, I think, forget that there is this period of time for Muhammad Ali after his career ends. Kind of the whole 1980s is a real low point for him. And on Saturday Night Live, Eddie Murphy used to do an impression of Muhammad Ali, like slurring children's rhymes. Like the idea was like Ali was brain damaged and couldn't really think well and was completely unable to take care of himself. Like the show In Living Color in the early 90s used to do a Muhammad Ali impression. And he's like trying to box when the doorbell rings at his house. Like, so Ali for like a 10-year period is seen as someone you would never want to emulate, someone whose life turned into a disaster, someone who is a cautionary tale. And it really starts, I think, with that biography by Thomas Hauser in 1991 of the rehabilitation of Ali's image. So it's not just Ali himself who controls this narrative. I mean, the meaning of Ali is almost, it was out of Ali's hands for a long time. And it's almost like Lonnie Ali and Thomas Hauser, and then the Ali Center kind of regains control for them of that narrative.
Mm-hmm. Now that's huge. And there's some other activity in the chat that I want to bring up too. That re-narrative and that shifting, as Ian says, like his children's literature is neutering his activism and legacy, so to speak. And it speaks to how education, I think, is so important moving forward, and especially for new generations, like you said, Nancy, that have no idea of this type of history and the multiple layers and shifts of good guy, bad guy that he and others have gotten to. I do want to get to a question Zane had on here that's addressed to you, Andreas, where she says, what do you say to people of color who feel that athletes have a responsibility to use their platform?
It's challenging because, like I said, some people that you want to speak, you don't really want to hear what they have to say. However, if you have a platform, you should use it in some way, shape, or fashion to uphold the culture in your community and the people that propped you up to get you to where you are today. So that means if you're going to put your money where your mouth is and donate to charity, if that means you have the opportunity to speak up on society ills, because a lot of athletes see and don't speak, and it doesn't take much to bring attention to something, even if you aren't terribly educated on it, you can still mention it. When Freddie Gray, the situation with Freddie Gray, I would have loved to hear more Baltimore athletes say something about it. I think it's their responsibility because it's your city, because you would want the same thing to happen to you. And that's probably what got you where you are today. So there is a responsibility for athletes to step up, but it's not always going to be in the way that you want it to be. So you have to find the comfortable medium for these athletes to, whether it's donating, speaking up, using their social media platforms, or propping up somebody else to be the leaders in the community. But we have to find different ways to have expectations on these athletes.
I
especially
guess
with women of color.
that's part of the danger. That's why I asked you, is because some people feel like they have a responsibility, but we can't control what they say or how
Absolutely.
big an influence it has. That's why I was interested in your opinion about that. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, it speaks to, cancel culture, like once somebody expresses their opinion, we're like, oh, what? Now we hate Trina? Okay, like, let me just delete this playlist. Like that happens on the regular, this type of cancel culture. And I want to get to one of the questions that, John, you put up here and asking for a little bit more of the background on the history that Malcolm X had on him, the influence that Malcolm X had on Muhammad Ali. Who wants to take that on this call, or who wants to kind of speak to that?
This is Bijan. I want to address it a little bit because of the mythos that he was tutored in the teachings of the Nation of Islam, first by Malcolm, or primarily by Malcolm, or largely by Malcolm, or something about Malcolm. A lot of people that haven't read, I don't know, maybe Sting Like a Bee, or the Jack Olson, or the Lewis book, or Black is Best is by Olson. But some of the books that were written about him in the mid '60s, before his title was stripped, aren't necessarily aware, or even magazine feature articles, aren't necessarily aware that when he was in high school, he fought in a Golden Gloves tournament in Chicago in '59 and purchased a copy of the 45, White Man's Heaven is a Black Man's Hell, according to him, from a Muslim on the street, Nation of Islam member on the street, a record by Lewis X, sort of a calypso parody, and that he already knew about the teachings of the Nation of Islam.
We'll see if Tanisha gets on here, but if not, we got Zumba. I don't know how, I've been doing this for so long, how someone got in, but it says a lot about what's going on.
I was going to say, it sort of proves a lot of points. That,
yes, it's wanting to stop dialogue. Oh wait, here's Tanisha. It's also, if it is, just kids, punks, that's also part of the conversation, because that's not the protesters, correct? Who are people are signaling as the chaos. That's another part, looters. And that's what I think the Zoom bomb showed, is that they don't want discussion. They just want to interfere. Tanisha, what do you think?
Look at my face.
I know. We were so close. I actually saw this. I apologize that I am not the.
It's not your fault. Don't apologize for something.
No, but I wish I knew. I told them I wish I had combat training on Zoom, that I knew like the switch.
People are learning that on the fly, because this ain't new. As is, one of my students actually, because I tweeted, I was like, great, we just got Zoom bombed. Got called N-word, personal information, whatever, cool. And then one of my students actually replied and was like, do you think that they're targeting, meetings that are having these types of discussions and topics? And I was like, no shit. Yes, they are. This is exactly who they're targeting, because they don't want any alternative information put out to combat that. It's the noise that people just want to continue to dilute the conversation, dilute any type of, and then there's just trolls too, which it's like, I don't know what type of service that is serving you emotionally to be a dick and to just be a troll and to like, I know I'm not sounding very doctoral with PhD right now, but it's like, it just needs to be said in plain English too. It's like, it's just crap. And this is a digital Zoom version of what needs to happen, I guess, in suits and in upstairs, politically, and to trying to combat this, because there is that noise. There will always be people trying to distract and break the spirit of people trying to make the difference, because that's what this is. we all are allies. We're all advocates. We're on the same wavelength, and anything they can do to continue to poke and disrupt the spirit and motivation to make a positive difference, they will continue to do, because then you know what? Once your spirit is broken as a human being, you stop. You stop trying and you just submit. But I've never settled in my life on anything. And I think all of us haven't settled either. So it's like poke away, but I'm gonna poke back. And it's exactly like when Andreas tweeted yesterday, he was asking people to comment on experiences of racism. Like, when was the first time? Mine, you know, 5th, 6th grade. Kid threw sand at me and pushed me out the way, and I grabbed a rock and threw it at him. It's like, I'm going to keep grabbing rocks when people poke back. And we all have to do that, you know, and that's what this is. It's like, yeah, we'll figure out the Zoom stuff. We'll figure out what other alternatives there are so we can continue to have these types of conversations, because I won't settle. And I don't think anybody else here will either, but that's that bullshit. That's that shit.
Yeah, and like on a practical level, like, you know, we were all sharing the link to this and whatnot, working in boxing media, especially if I retweet that out, it's probably 1 second before it winds up on a white supremacist timeline.
Absolutely.
You know what I mean? Like, we're not too far divorced from like real deal bad racists in our industry. So it's not hard for them to have found that link.
Yeah. Well, you know what? I'm not, you know, you can keep poking. We're going to keep on pushing back. I'm not going to only stay in my insular academic world. You know, I am in a waiting room now. But you know, Tanisha, thank you. You know, so glad we said that.
Yeah, sorry.
Sorry,
I've got.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, I've got the speaker panel going on the other window.
Well, if we could, Tanisha, you gave a great report. How could we wrap this up?
Yeah.
We had 3 or 4 minutes left, and let's do it. We are not going to be denied.
No,
And I will
for sure.
put out this video. I have this, maybe this is actually recording right now. Also on
No, because this is part
all
one.
together, and take that part out, or keep it in, but
Yeah,
probably, you know,
yeah,
but I
but
put this
it's-
all together.
Right. We were almost done. It was great, and it is just part one. Like, we all know that this is going to be an ongoing conversation with us and others that I think can add quality insight to this conversation and to discuss literally like what this is. I mean, if we're talking about Ali's legacy here, then we just have to call it plain and like what we were saying. So like, yeah, these are just racist troll bombs trying to disrupt the spirit and quality conversation that we were having. Not having it. No, obviously that ain't me, that ain't my style, and I know that's not anybody else's either. But this is kind of part one. We'll certainly have another conversation as well and try and conceptualize and put everything together in the scope of the uprisings that are occurring right now and in the context of sports, period. And that's every sport. We know the NBA has been the most progressive, I believe, in professional sports anyway, and leading conversations about social injustice. We do want to bring in like MMA, pro wrestling, baseball, everything, and just have a sports and society conversation as well. And as it relates to these multiple layers that Ali obviously embodies, and then also what all of us are going through right now when it comes to race, gender, representation, and just straight up white supremacy, and how to stop this, and how as a nation we can be better. Because it's terrifying. It's terrifying out there. You know, we all have just extreme different experiences, and a lot of it, you know, some people have kids and they're asking me like, what do I say to my kid? And I'm like, don't be a dick, lead with that. You know, it's just so much that we have to do collectively on multiple levels. And so I think once, you know, I've already seen a lot of great folks organize resources, books, podcasts, movies, music, art, just ways to educate ourselves, and also lists of things to do. How do you turn data into doing? Like, how do we be doers? Like, in terms of supporting, getting people registered to vote, supporting Black businesses, all of these things I think are a part of it, because it's nothing that can change today, June 3rd. We're gonna try and make the seeds so we don't have to do this again in another 20, 30 fucking years, you know? So it's one of those things, but yeah, I know I kind of rambled, but so forgive me in that. But yeah, this is part one, and there will be a hell of a lot more. And I hope, you know, the invitations to you all that re-logged in with the new link will come back. We certainly want to keep hearing from you. I know we had an hour just because we were trying to make time for people to listen to President Obama speak in a few minutes, but we'll do this again.
Yeah, I cannot underscore everything you just said. Thank you also for giving the emotion of what was we were feeling, because yeah, we want to do more. We want to bring in fighters. We want to bring in media, you know, of all you know, aspects of it. But yeah, MMA. We need to have these conversations. Also, what's going on with the protests, we got a feeling of what it feels like. We were just doing a thoughtful discussion in memory of Muhammad Ali's anniversary of his death, but you know, also showing how it is relevant to today, and that, you know, where whoever wanted to just break in and cause havoc or just push it down, you know, we got to remember that these conversations are not always easy.
No.
But I'm still having them.